see you guys in the dark.
This story is not about a ghost or an encounter with a creepy stranger. It's not even about a near-death experience or something like that. As a matter of fact, I was never in danger during the event that I'm about to tell you about. Nonetheless, it's a disturbing memory that will carry on with me until the day that I die. I grew up in a small city, the kind of place that you could barely call a town if it wasn't for the sheer number of people living there. Downtown was only a couple of blocks long, and in the middle of it was one of the biggest buildings in the area. It was the local movie theater, named after the city. I remember going there when I was very young, about 7 years old, and watching the first Pokemon movie. It was probably nothing compared to the theaters that we have nowadays, but back then, it was huge for me. I loved it. So when a few years later, I heard the cinema was going out of business, I felt really sad about it. The building was sold to a religious group that used it for their services. You know the type. Loud music, big crowds with their arms in the air singing prayers, some having seizures on stage while the pastor yells through a microphone. Every time I walked past that old cinema, I would see the announcements of the congregation where the movie posters would have been, and if they were in session, you could hear them singing from the other side of the street. This group owned the cinema for nearly a decade, until the local government bought back the building in order to restore it as a historic landmark of the city. When this happened, I was studying construction, with the intent to follow architecture or civil engineering at college. And my class was very lucky to be involved with the cinema's restoration project, because 2 of our teachers were architects working on it. I will always remember the day that we went to go visit the old cinema. Our class was small, only a handful of students, but we were all around the same age. So we all shared childhood memories of when the cinema was operational. We ran through the corridors of the auditorium, sat in the chairs just like we did when we were little kids, and began stomping on the wooden floor with our feet, filling the entire room with the echoes of our drumming and our laughter. A little ritual of sorts everyone used to do right before the beginning of the movie. Once nostalgia time was over, we went back to the purpose of the trip and began to survey the building. We were very excited because this was a unique opportunity to go into the places that we would have never been allowed to otherwise. So we made sure to check every last corner, every single room, no matter how far, no matter how obscure. The first one that we found was below the stage. On one of the corners, there was a little door, not very visible, probably because it was meant for maintenance staff only. Behind it, we found a long room filled with rusty boilers, part of the old heating system that was no longer in use. The place was a little creepy, with all those old tanks and pipes crowding the narrow space. But what we found past them was what really started to freak us out. This room was small, very small. It was, after all, basically just leftover space behind the boilers, yet it contrasted so much with the rest of the area around it. It may as well have been from a different place altogether. The walls were painted a light color, white I think, but I don't remember it very well because what really got my attention were the drawings in them. There were rainbows, a smiling sun, trees, flowers, and happy little people with smiles on their faces of dotted eyes. It was a daycare. The whole class and teacher gathered to see the discovery. We were all very confused about the strange placing of this room. Okay, we would understand the need for a place to keep the kids that were too little to be amongst the crowd during the prayers, or maybe the ones of people who worked there, but the placing was just odd. The stage was probably one of the loudest places in the auditorium during the services, and this was right below it, so there was no way it could be a quiet place for the children. We left the boiler room and continued our tour through the theater, a little puzzled about our finding, but not giving it much thought. Outside of the auditorium, there were the bathrooms, both in terrible condition, the ticket booth sale, and a huge set of stairs that led to a mezzanine in the auditorium. Half of the seats there were totally ruined due to a water leak in the roof, and I cursed these people for not taking proper care of this building. With that part done, all that was left was the projection room, on the 3rd floor. Behind the ticket booth, there was a door that led to a spiral stair. I don't remember how tall it actually was, but it must have been over 10 meters of metallic steps without a single resting spot. I wasn't exactly an athlete, but I would walk several kilometers with no problem, and rode on a bike to and from school every single day. Yet by the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was exhausted. And I wasn't the only one. All of my classmates complained about how hard it was to walk up there. After a short break to catch our breath, we moved on to explore the third floor. It was roughly a narrow passageway with a couple of divisions to form different rooms, but it was more than enough for what it was made for. The first room from the stairs was a storage deposit, probably where they kept the movies and other equipment, and except for some trash, it was mostly empty. The second room was the one we were all excited to see, the projection room. The old machine was so big that it was still there, and there were even some pieces scattered around. It was quite a piece of history, and we were all very thrilled to check it out, so no one really bothered to move on to the very last room until we were about to leave, and there we saw it again. There was a train in this one instead of a rainbow. Something was written on it in big, colorful letters. Something about Christ. I can't remember it well. The drawings were a little bit old, the paint slightly peeled from the walls, but the colors were just as cheerful as you would expect for a place where children would play. My heart sank to my stomach as I came to the realization of what that place really was. The one behind the boilers probably serving the same purpose. I took notice of how isolated that room was. Literally the furthest away that you could possibly get from everyone else. I thought about the 3 floors of stairs, and imagined what it would have been like to a child to walk all the way up, only to end up in that room, the room with the colorful train in the wall. My classmates and I exchanged horrified expressions, as I knew they were thinking the same thing. We never visited the theater again, even though we continued with the restoration project for several months. We never talked about those 2 rooms. Cases of molestation in the church are well known by everyone, to the point that the priest is practically a cliché. But this is the kind of thing you think happens in some place far away, in another city, even in another country. You never imagine it can happen in the very same town that you live, the place where you grew up, in the very building where you once watched a Pokemon movie while you were 7 years old. This happened a few days ago when I was on a road trip with my cousin. I'll be referring to him again as James. For reference, I'm 13 and female. James is 21. James and I were on a road trip from my grandmother's to my aunt's house. I have a great relationship with my cousin, so my parents let me go on trips with him occasionally. It's about a 10-hour drive, and we were about 3 hours into the drive. It was about 9 p.m. at this time. I was pretty sleep-deprived, and everything was hilarious at that moment. So when I saw this red semi-truck outside of my window, I just laughed my ass off. The man in the truck was heavyset. That's an understatement. And had a long, untamed beard. He had a creepy vibe, but I waved to him. He in turn did a groping motion to me, finding it more hilarious than creepy. I started laughing harder and told James the story, doing the whole groping motion and all. He looked creeped out and disgusted, but there wasn't anything either of us could do. A while later, about 4.5 hours into our drive, James pulls into a rest stop. I walked into the bathroom, and when I come out, the man was just standing there. He looked to be about 6 foot tall at least. I looked at the glass door leading into the building and saw James, glaring daggers at the door. I was confused and walked back to the car. What he told me really creeped me out. So much so, I started crying. Then again, I had been awake for around 20 hours. The man had stared and followed me inside of the building, mumbling shit about me. James said he was basically talking normally. He attempted to comfort me, but quickly said that he had to go to the bathroom and went inside. A few seconds later, when I was in the car, the guy was at my window. He stared at me, a wide, creepy grin. He stared, saying that I should go with him, and he was going to treat me good. He offered me candy and just tried to coax me into his truck. I was busy bawling my eyes out. Then, right on cue, James walks out and yells at the guy, threatening him. The guy backed off and got into his truck. He still just stared at me, the grin still on his face. We floored it out of there. We wanted to get as far away from that guy as possible. It was around 12 a.m. when we pulled into a motel to sleep. The rest of the night until 8 a.m. was fine. Nothing really happened. Sadly, that didn't last long. When we were at a restaurant eating breakfast, the same fat shit sat across from us. He grinned at me, and James just looked pissed off. The guy walked by the table when going to the bathroom and brushed his hand on my shoulder, doing the same on the way back. A quick note, James is a chill dude and will let most anything slide. But because he's known me since I was just a baby, he's protective over me. He's not like that to even my siblings. He and I are very close. He was obviously pissed before, but at that point, he stood up from his seat, walked over to this guy's table. He started yelling shit about he better stop following us and back off of me. He made no threats, but he did curse a lot. I felt pretty nervous and just wanted to go. The guy stood up and smacked at James and yelled how I was leading him on. The guy was about 6 foot and James was about 6'8". Their argument continued until the cops had came and separated it. They got the story and came to the conclusion that because he was assaulted, we could press charges. He said no, and we just continued on with the day. The rest of the trip was pretty bland. The guy wasn't seen for the rest of it. However, James did follow me like a bodyguard whenever we went anywhere. Even though he was protecting me, I was terrified. He looks scary as shit, but he's a cinnamon roll. Also on the trip, I tried to ask him about what happened when I was 7. It was another story that I had told, and he just played dumb. Bitch boy wouldn't tell me shit. Anyways, I hope everybody enjoyed. I'm a 25-year-old female. For the purpose of being anonymous, I will refer to myself as Sabrina. I'm from Romania. English is not my native language, but I shall try my best to make the story easy to be understood. My stories contain that of what would be angels, spirits, demons, archangels, satanic people doing forbidden sessions of voodoo, and everything for this particular story. I sort of believe this is not necessarily a bad encounter, or so I lie to myself sometimes. I live in Romania. Our country has Orthodox religion, basically similar to Christianity. We believe in God and Jesus, with small certain similarities and differences. For example, I don't know if it's the same as Catholics do. We keep the deceased for a night. We call it the sleeping duty, or a guard night. We do not take the body out of its house that he or she lived in for their entire life, in order to help the spirit find its way to heaven easier. The next 2 days, as we bury the bodies after about 3 days, we take the body to the church where loved ones, but not relatives to the deceased, may come and pay respects to that person. After this process is concluded, we bury the body at the cemetery where the priest will chant prayers, helping the spirit of the deceased understand that he or she is no longer among the living, as Romanians are very spiritual people, and believe in the afterlife, spirits, and even in bad spirits that linger the world unable to move on. Understanding this is important as the story is pretty detailed. I had 5 grandparents, 3 grandmothers, and 2 grandfathers. My first grandfather, we'll call him Michael, died when I was 6 years old due to a heart attack in August of 2007. He raised me, and his death marked my life ever since because I couldn't grasp the significance of death. I would frequently dream about him, his messages, his signs. I would hear him in my dreams as he would guide me to be a good person, and so on. But even then, as a child, I knew what was a dream and what was reality. His wife, who we shall call Anna, was my adoptive grandmother, as my real, by-blood grandmother, name was Margaret, had died when my mom was 2 years old due to an abortion. I'm not sure if she was trying to abort my mother or a third child, since my mother has a brother, and she was the second child. During the communist years, Romania had a strict law regarding abortions, and women would abort the fetuses on their own, in the privacy of their homes by themselves, as no medic would agree to help with the procedure due to the fear of being sentenced to life in prison. She died, and my mother grew up without a mother until the age of 6 years old. Needless to say, I never met her or knew anything about Margaret, my blood grandmother. But this story is about my grandmother, my adoptive one, Anna. She was a very spiritual, wise, kind-hearted, and intellectual woman. She never had children of her own. She adopted my mom and uncle. Their names aren't important for this story. My grandfather, Michael, was only dating my grandmother, but after my mother had met her on a family visit on her side, in Moldova, It's a town in Romania. They got married soon after. My grandfather was a military general, and raising 2 children of 6 years and 13 years was hard. How they decided to get married? Well, it was thanks to my mother, because as soon as she first saw Grandma Anna, she went straight to her, at the age of 6, raised both her arms up, and asked in a jolly child voice, "Hi, my name is Christina. Would you like to be my mommy?" My grandmother burst in tears, picked her up, and immediately created a connection with my mother, whom she raised and loved as her own. It was not the same for my uncle, as he was 13 at that time, and knew his own mother. Margaret had died, and why? He denounced her, and made her life much harder. After raising my mom and uncle, my uncle had 2 children of her own, a boy and a girl. She raised the girl, and then the boy was born with a calcium crisis that made her faint and hit her head. She refused to raise my cousin afterwards, as she was afraid that she would drop holding the baby. My uncle never forgave her for that, and hated her even more. When I was born, I was the light of their life, as she loved my mother from moment one, and my grandfather Michael adored my mother. Because I'm a replica of my mother, same eyes, same face, body shape, they immediately took me in, raised me as my father worked in 3 different jobs. My mom was a pediatric nurse and worked in shifts. I loved growing up with her. Like I said, she was an extremely spiritual person. She loved to meditate. She would tell me about her dreams. She taught me how to decode them and what it meant. She told me about ghost encounters that she had in her life, and always told me not to fear any spirit that comes close to me in my life, because ghosts see us as beams of light guiding them to God when they are confused. She did this until I was 18 years old. We were very close, and I was living 5 minutes away from her, so I could visit her daily, sometimes still sleep at her place. Her hobby was to read the future in some cards that she owned, not tarot cards, but normal cards with some inscriptions that she had, such as Encounter with Mysterious Man, Beware, Crying Child, Careful, Dangerous Woman. On New Year of 2017, at 3:15 a.m., I called my grandma to wish her a Happy New Year, and to let her know how much I and my family loved her and appreciated her. I'd like to mention that Romanians rarely express their love by saying "I love you" to our mothers, fathers, grandparents. We consider that you show your love by what you do in your life, and how you respect them, rather than just say the words. But that night, for the first time in 23 years, I felt the need to tell her that. I still don't know why. Her voice changed. You could hear her chuckle in soft, happy tears as she would hear that, and said that she loved us all back, and forever will. Nothing seemed suspicious, as I'm a very sensitive and emotional woman myself. So the night went on normally. She was at a party. I was with my fiancé at his house. The next day, 1st of January, I received a phone call from my father who told me that Grandma Anna had died the previous night. I couldn't express in words how my heart simply left my body, as if my own existence had stopped, refusing to acknowledge that she was dead. I rushed home. The police was there. The ambulance was there. They said that she died of a heart attack due to the climate change, same as my grandfather Michael did 11 years before her by the same cause. But what I found weird was the time of death. I still had her last phone call at 3:15 a.m. The policeman and ambulance staff analyzed her and declared that it was around midnight. They said that there was no way I could have talked to her at 3:15 a.m., as for by that time the body would have already begun to rigor mortis. Who did I talk to then? Because it was her phone number. It was her voice. She seemed incredibly fine. Call it a sick joke, or just medical staff TOD. During her funeral, I decided to write her a goodbye letter, as I am very spiritual, and even though no one will read it, I like to consider that she took the message I had for her in heaven to pass it down to my other grandmother, Margaret, and 2 grandfathers, Michael and Peter. I wrote it in that letter that I do love her a lot, that I thank her for every sacrifice that she has done for me, and that I wish to tell Margaret, the real grandmother which I have never met, because she died from the abortion long before I was born, that I loved her too, although I never met her. I put that letter in my grandmother's coffin, kissed her forehead, and watched her go on to her last road. My mom knows about the letter. She has yet to ask me about what I wrote in it. After the funeral, I got a phone call from my grandmother. Yes, my grandmother, Anna. At first, I thought it was my father, as he would still use her phone to let all our relatives from other countries know that she had died. So normally, I answered the phone, and I hear something unimaginable, impossible, formidable. I hear my Anna. I hear her voice clearly. I hear her laughing voice, with some static occurring whenever she would pause. It was a soft, fading voice, but nothing scary, nothing fearful or intimidating. It made me feel like she was indeed there, but I will admit the whole situation did freak me out. She said to me, "Hello, dear. I called to let you know that I passed the message, and I love you too." I couldn't reply as the phone call hung up right after. It left me feeling so vulnerable, as I thought maybe someone is playing a sick joke on me. But it couldn't be that. I saw my Nana be buried. Myself. I saw the coffin be sealed. I saw the letter exit inside the coffin until the very last second. No one took it out to read it. She had 3 sisters, but they were all dead, and none of them had her voice. No one could have repeated her voice that perfectly. But the even scarier part comes after that first phone call. After another week. I remember it was during another day of Monday, right 1 week after the first phone call. My phone starts ringing again under the same number. I answer. Already have forgotten about what has happened, and I hear an old lady, a voice that I couldn't feel familiar. I did not know who that lady was. It was a pretty soft but strong voice. It felt like a relatively young woman, but inexperienced. I would say around 30 to 40 years or so. I would like to mention that this time I was in the same room with my father, who owned her phone still, and I received the call. Her phone is in front of me on the table, and not ringing. I open her phone as I speak to my phone. Her phone had no battery, and it was dead closed, but I still get her phone call. I answer. I hear this weird lady, and she goes like this. "Hello, sweetheart. You don't know me, but I know you. I received the message, and I love you too." Then the phone call hangs up again. Needless to say, I started screaming and panicking so hard that my dad immediately went to the telephone service to find out who was playing pranks on us. They went through their profile, numbers dialed, and received. My number was not in the agenda of calls, so we decided to disable her number. Ever since then, we do not receive phone calls anymore, but I do go to the cemetery more often and talk to them. This year is the first year from her death, so we are now sort of celebrating her memory. But for me, personally, I do not celebrate her memory as I feel she is constantly physically with me. I often have dreams of her. She would often visit me at night. I'm saying dreams because I feel like I'm going insane if I ever conclude to these situations being something other than dreams. I guess I'm trying to say thank you for giving me the possibility to share this with you. To all the people out there who encounter ghosts or paranormal activity, I'm going to say what my grandmother Anna taught me all my life. Do not be afraid of them, as they are just confused, lost souls who see you as beams of light helping them to find God. The way you feel about them will conclude in the way that they react, and afterwards end up scaring you.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.